You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 1st of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme, Israel's Prime Minister pushes the country, not for the first time, to the brink of constitutional crisis. Also ahead.
MAGA is humbling. It's not bold, oh, we're great. It's a humbling statement to make America great again, because we're not what we used to be. We want to get back to that, and that's going to take work.
Views from Florida ahead of special elections, which are being seen as the first referendum on the second Trump presidency. Also ahead, Myanmar and the difficulties of helping a country which won't help itself. Later in the show.
Hello, I'm Ed Stocker in Milan, and today I'm going to be talking about Italy's birth rate and the fact that it's continuing to decline.
If Italy's government wants more Italians, why is its government making citizenship harder to acquire? And what do we learn from the new Michelin Guide, other than that our favourite French restaurants might just have put their prices up? All coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Even before Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, Israel was involved in a conflict with itself. This week, as Israel has resumed hostilities against external enemies in Gaza and Lebanon, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also returned to his internal offensive against Israel's institutions, specifically its judiciary, to whom Netanyahu is still theoretically answering over corruption charges. Well, I'm joined with more on this by Daniela Peled, Managing Editor of the Institute of War and Peace Reporting. Daniela, briefly, first of all, why do some in Israel fear a constitutional crisis? What issue is Netanyahu forcing here?
Well, this would his reforms, as they put it, would mean that the judiciary no longer has the power to overturn government decisions. It's taking removing another level of oversight. And this has been really unpopular amongst wide ranges of Israeli society. There were repeated weekly demonstrations. This is not really a left-wing issue. There was quite a consensus that this was going to destroy Israel's democracy.
In particular, there is an issue over the Shin Bet chief, Ronan Bar, who Netanyahu has tried to sack. The Supreme Court has stopped him from doing that. What happens if Netanyahu goes ahead and says he's doing it anyway?
Well, currently, his dismissal is frozen. Hearings due from the High Court next week. But the High Court said that Netanyahu was allowed to look for his replacement, which is which no one really knows what it is, because he appointed Eli Shavit, a former head of the Navy, to head the Shin Bet, which is Israel's internal security service, and then withdrew the nomination less than a day later without any explanation whatsoever.
I mean, this idea that Netanyahu is trying to place the judiciary under political control, is it as straightforward as him trying to evade answering, the charges he faces?
Well, there's an element of that. It's a question of whether he's ruling the country for his own benefit or for the benefit of the citizens. The war, and it says as it carries on, and obviously Israel restarted it recently, has been seen and widely interpreted as something that he is using to keep himself out of trouble, to keep his coalition afloat. But this backwards and forwards over the head of Shin Bet also raises some serious questions about Israel's national security. Of course, Ronen Bar was head of the Shin Bet at the time of its intelligence failures and over the October 7th attacks. He had pledged to resign when he'd fulfilled his duty and all the Israeli hostages were returned. So his days were numbered, as it were. But this is a highly unusual appointment, not least because it's someone from not within the service, but also it came and it went. The only explanation that commentators have is that Eli Shabbat was also critical of Netanyahu's judicial reforms and had joined protests against this. Beyond that, it's a murky situation indeed.
You mentioned those protests which were occurring prior to October 7th, 2023, and to remind our listeners, they were huge. They did involve actually quite noticeable percentages of Israel's entire population. But has there been, or is there now, much in the way of coherent opposition within Israeli politics, within the Knesset in particular?
Well, you still have ongoing protests, which are around the issue of the hostages. You know, that there is some quite outspoken opposition and criticism of the Netanyahu government, despite the fact that the conflict in one form or another is ongoing. But this, we are the well-established, most right-wing government in Israel's history, which could only possibly be replaced by a more right-wing government. Is pretty solid, really, and Netanyahu is presiding over this coalition of the far right and really doing everything to keep it in place. So the idea that there's a coherent protest movement, because of course this isn't an ideological thing. This isn't really a left or right thing so much as the judicial reform had a really large degree of consensus. It wasn't a far left pro-Palestinian movement as far as some of the right wing would try to depict it. And that was people who were genuinely concerned about the future of their country's direction.
Daniela Pelled at the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. Here is Monica Lillis with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. China staged surprise military drills off Taiwan's coast on Tuesday, accusing its leaders of being parasites. The drills were accompanied by a propaganda campaign, with Beijing calling it a stern warning against separatism. Taiwan sent warships towards China's navy in response. Denmark and the US are to hold their first high-level talks since Donald Trump came to power and declared he wished to take Greenland. The Danish foreign minister will travel to Brussels to meet his foreign counterpart at a NATO gathering later this week. The cast of Sam Mendes' 4 upcoming Beatles biopics has officially been announced. The long-awaited films will star Harris Dickinson, Paul Mescal, Barry Keoghan and Joseph Quinn. The Oscar-winning director confirmed each film will focus on one member of the band and will all release in April 2028. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Monica. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. In the US, Republicans are hoping to expand their slim majority in the House of Representatives with victories in today's special elections. Voters in 2 congressional districts in Florida will head to the polls in a first referendum on President Donald Trump's second term in office. Both districts are leaning heavily Republican, but Democrats are hopeful that they can nevertheless stage a surprise. Reporter H.J. Mai spent several days in the Sunshine State last week to find out how people view this election.
San Augustine is a historic small town on Florida's northeast coast. The city, known for being the oldest European settlement in the United States, is part of Florida's 6th congressional district. On Tuesday, voters here will choose a new congressman. President Trump won the district in November by 30 points, yet the race could be much closer than that.
I know that people in our community here in St. Johns County, we're about 3-1 Republican versus Democrat.
That's Denver Cook. He's a Republican and the chair of the St. Johns County Republican Party. St. Johns is among several counties that make up Florida's 6th congressional district, which was previously represented by White House National Security Advisor Michael Waltz. It's a rural district with a majority white population. In addition, roughly a third of its population is 65 or older. All factors that have benefited Republicans in the past.
Donald Trump, when he ran in November and last year, he turned out massive numbers. We had over 90% Republican turnout in St. Johns County for Donald Trump in November.
This is undoubtedly Trump country. Driving through the district, you'll see many Trump flags, bumper stickers, and other MAGA memorabilia. People here face the same economic challenges as in other parts of the country. And while nobody is happy with rising costs, Many are even more concerned with what's happening in Washington and the federal debt.
What Donald Trump's correct about, and I understand people may feel some personal pain in all of this, we can't afford it anymore. We just can't. We have to take care of our house before we can help others. And our house is broken. MAGA is humbling. It's not bold, oh, we're great. It's a humbling statement to make America great again. Because we're not what we used to be. We want to get back to that. And that's going to take work.
This sentiment has contributed to Trump's decisive victory in November, but it is showing first signs of cracks. Simply put, not everyone is willing to go through this type of pain. Like Ken Rayback, the Daytona Beach resident cast his vote for Tuesday's special election during last week's early voting period. And while he didn't want to share who he voted for, he made clear that he has concerns over the administration's actions.
I'm not happy with what's going on in Washington, and I would like to see a change.
Rayback, who has worked as an executive in the hospitality industry for most of his life, described himself as an independent, even though he's a registered Republican. He says he has never voted for Trump, which makes him an outlier in this part of Florida. Rayback has several gripes with the Trump administration. He mentioned cuts to federal programs and departments, but a newly created Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, as one area of concern.
DOGE, Elon Musk, the Supreme Court, the gentleman who is currently our president, he was elected our president, I respect that. Some of the stuff I think he's doing is right. Some of the stuff I think he's doing, I don't agree with it.
Married couple Brian Money and Susanna Pavel are also registered Republicans and decided to vote for Democratic candidate Josh Whale over Republican opponent Randy Fine. Their biggest concern is the lack of pushback against Trump and his agenda. Republicans in Congress are not doing their jobs, says Pavel.
They're being completely complicit and letting Trump do whatever he wants. So we are pushing really hard for this election because we have to have some balance. Otherwise, we're going to lose our democracy.
It's those type of voters that Republicans are concerned about ahead of Tuesday. And with Trump not being on the ballot, there's a fear that some voters simply stay home, says Cook.
Nobody else is Donald Trump. So my concern would be for Republicans that some of the voters may say, well, it's not Donald Trump. I don't need to go. If you actually want his agenda done, it's not just Donald Trump that's going to get it done. If you want Donald Trump's MAGA agenda, the Republican Party platform under Donald Trump, to be successful, you need to have the House and the Senate, or it doesn't work. You end up with divided government. That is what we've had for 40 years. That gets nothing done.
The Democratic Party realized that there could be an upset in Florida and poured millions of dollars into the race. Trump himself acknowledged that Tuesday's special elections are crucial because of the narrow House majority.
We don't want to take any chances because it is tight.
Last week, Trump pulled his nominee for UN ambassador, New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, because that would further reduce the Republican advantage in the House. And while a Democratic victory in either of Tuesday's special elections is still unlikely, there's hope among Democrats, and it's because of Trump's actions, says Susan Horowitz.
What we're seeing in general here is that people who had become disillusioned with the Democratic Party, they're coming back. This is the best organizing tool. Donald Trump is the best organizing tool for the Democrats right now, because they're saying, oh, gee, I was discouraged, but now I know that we're fighting him and we're here to help you fight him.
Tuesday's special elections are a first test for the Trump administration, Musk and DOGE. And even though Republicans are likely to defend both seats, even a narrow victory could be a first sign of trouble for Republicans down the road, especially in more evenly divided districts.
Any inroads is a good thing, but right now we need a win.
For Monocle, I'm H.J. Ma in Florida's 6th Congressional District.
Thank you, H.J. You are listening to The Briefing. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. The earthquake which struck Myanmar last Friday would have tested the capacities of any state. At least 2,000 people are confirmed dead, and it is feared that the actual death toll may run to several multiples of that. Damage to buildings and infrastructure is also considerable. At least 3 hospitals are known to have been levelled and 22 more damaged or unstable. In Mandalay, one of the worst affected cities, many people are still camping outside, fearing further building collapses. For Myanmar, poor, isolated and racked by civil war, it is especially challenging, and ditto for organisations trying to help. Now, I'm joined with more on this by Scott Craig, Communications Officer with the IFRC in Geneva. Scott, first of all, as far as we're able to tell, what capacity does the Myanmarese state have to respond to a disaster of this magnitude?
Hi, Andrew. Thanks very much for having me. Yes, so we've been in close contact with our teams on the ground in Myanmar. So our colleagues are from the Myanmar Red Cross Society. They were already in the country and they were able to respond immediately. But what they're telling us is that there's a level of destruction on the ground that is simply unprecedented, certainly in recent times. And that, as you said in your introduction, there is extensive damage and destruction to infrastructure, roads, bridges, hospitals, and there are actually still people trapped beneath rubble at this time as well. And clearly, the earthquake struck on Friday, and so there's clearly a race against time to try and get people out who may still be alive. We do have search and rescue teams who are aiding in those efforts, as well as providing first aid and relief items. But you're right. I mean, the country has been entirely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster. And one of the things that the teams have told me that I thought was particularly striking is that there are people camped out, as you said, but people camped out in hospitals that have either been damaged or destroyed. So you have people being treated outdoors. And there's a lack of pretty much everything, a lack of water, a lack of electricity, a lack of medical supplies and kits. So it's a pretty dire situation on the ground.
The Myanmarese regime is, of course, extremely insular, to put it charitably. How receptive have they been to outside help?
So the Red Cross is in a slightly unique position because we were already in the country. So the Myanmar Red Cross is already in the communities in the worst affected areas because they're from those communities. And so we already had first aid kits and pre-positioned supplies in the country. Clearly more will be needed. And we are working with everyone and continue to advocate with everyone for there to be the greatest level of access necessary, because we don't want humanitarian aid to become politicized in any way.
Is there any way of avoiding that, though? There are reports, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, that aid to rebel-held areas is being blocked or indeed being stolen by Myanmar's military, and that air raids against rebels are continuing.
Yeah, so I mean, for us at the Red Cross, I mean, we're independent, impartial, and neutral, and so we work with all communities across the country to support everyone affected by this emergency, and so. We advocate with all of the relevant authorities in Myanmar for access, and I would say as well that we again, to reiterate the point about neutrality and impartiality, that's a really unique value of the Red Cross, and as I said, we're already working in the country in the affected areas.
I mean, this is the kind of disaster which one might have anticipated a few years ago that the United States would take an active part in, riding to the rescue in. That seems less likely in the present circumstances. Does that make the job of international NGOs any more or less difficult?
Well, at the IFRC, we've released an immediate release of money, 2 million Swiss francs in emergency funding we've released And we're appealing for 100 million Swiss francs more, because this is going to not just be about Myanmar's immediate needs, it's going to be about the longer term needs for the country. And we've appealed for that 100 million over the next 2 years. So that as the operation moves into not just a response phase, but a reconstruction and redevelopment phase as well. And I think that the scale of the disaster in Myanmar, I think, underscores the need for humanitarian assistance and humanitarian funding.
Just finally, the Red Cross in its various guises and the Red Crescent is well used, of course, to responding to disasters of extraordinary magnitude. But when confronted with something like this, what is your protocol for where you even start?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because obviously we train and we have a lot of planning in place for a disaster on this scale. I think the first thing to say is that we maintain pre-positioned supplies and stockpiles in different places around the world that are able to be moved quickly to where they're needed, and also pre-positioned supplies in countries. So we had stocks in Myanmar that were ready to go, and more being brought in. I think the first thing to do on the ground is what our teams have been doing, which is firstly to respond to immediate needs. Secondly, to quickly assess what is needed in terms of shelter, health, water supplies, first aid, and other needs, and quickly assess those. And then thirdly, rapidly move teams around the country who can meet those needs. So I think it cascades down from the global to the regional to the local level.
Scott Craig with the IFRC in Geneva, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. There are at present nearly 60 million people in Italy, which does not sound like a perilous shortage, especially when one considers the considerable Italian diaspora. However, Italy's government is vexed by declining birth rates, which have now struck a record low and have coincided with a sharp and startling uptick in Italians leaving the country. Possibly counterintuitively, Italy's government nevertheless proposes to tighten citizenship requirements to freeze out people claiming an Italian passport on the basis of a great-great-grandparent who happened to be present for the unification of 1861. Well, Monocle's European editor-at-large, Ed Stocker, joins us now from Milan. Ed, first of all, we are clear now on what Italy's birth rate is, but is anybody clear on why it has tailed off to such an extent?
Well, I mean, obviously, this is part of a pattern. You know, it's been declining for some time. The positive news, some countries are worse, Spain, South Korea, but obviously this is of concern. Like you mentioned, it's continuing to go down. It's now the worst on record. 1.18 children per woman born in 2024, down from a historic low of 1.19 back in 1995. Why this is happening? Basically, there's not enough incentives out there to make people want to have children. You know, if you look at certain issues in Italy, including the fact that real wages, or wages in real terms, have actually decreased since the 1990s. So, you know, the cost of living in comparison to wages here is very high, and that's been putting off people having children. You know, population is down, particularly in the centre and the southern parts of the country. The richer northern part of the country did see a slight population increase. And so demographics has a big part to play in it. The government, obviously, you know, we have this right wing, this far right government from Giorgia Meloni. She made family values a very central part of her election campaign. And she's sort of been very vocal in saying that she wanted to halt this decline. But there have been some incentives from this new government for the 2025 budget, including a bonus of €1,000 for each child that is born in Italy during this year. But at the end of the day, they need to do something to really halt the fact that people, like you mentioned, Andrew, are still looking to overseas in terms of work opportunities. There's not enough jobs being created in Italy to make people want to stay. 156,000 Italians emigrated in 2024, some of those top countries, including the UK, as well as Germany and Spain. And so, it's hard to know what will halt this decline. Certainly what is true is that Italy at some point, arguably even now, is going to need an influx of people from overseas to help fill potential gaps in the job market, given that it is a rapidly aging population. Life expectancy is actually up as well to 83.4 years per adult, meaning a rapidly declining and aging population, Andrew.
Well, if that is the case, if Italy does need more people, why is it making it more difficult for people to claim Italian citizenship? Granted that the current regime is unusually generous. It's much more common for countries to cut it off at a grandparent. Letting you reel it all the way out to great-great-parents is pretty extraordinary, especially when you consider how many million people around the world must have at least one Italian great-great-grandparent. So what's the rationale for tightening it?
Yeah, between 2021 and 24, Italians abroad was actually up 40%. So if you kind of compare that with what's happening in Italy and compared to what's happening abroad, this sort of odd rule that anyone with an Italian ancestor alive after, to give you a very specific date, the 17th of March, 1861 could seek a citizenship. I lived in Argentina for 4.5 years, where there are a lot of people of Italian descent, and I had quite a few friends who did go and claim and get that Italian passport. Tajani, the foreign minister here, saying the system being abused, and I can kind of see that, actually. I mean, a lot of people essentially claiming that passport with no actual desire to go and live in Italy. Namely, they wanted it because an Italian passport is one of the best in terms of visa-free access. And of course, they wanted to be able to travel around the EU zone, the Schengen zone, without having any issues. So a lot of people just getting these passports to make travel in Europe much easier, don't speak Italian and don't have any intention of going to live in Italy. So it wasn't really solving any of the issues that Italy has in terms of needing to up its domestic population. What will be interesting to watch is actually, Andrew, a referendum that's happening in June. A number of things are on the ballot for this June referendum, including reducing the number of years that you need to be in Italy before you can apply for an Italian passport. It's currently 10 years. Over 600,000 signatures were handed in to make this referendum happen. The proposal is to change that law from 10 years to 5, which means yours truly could also apply for a passport potentially if that does happen. But it just kind of, if you look at that, the context of those people in Italy, that the migrants that are the numbers are up in Italy, a lot of them can't get passports, and even the children of migrants who are born in this country don't get an automatic passport. You don't get an automatic one like you do in other countries around the world, including the US, although Trump wants to change that. You have to wait until you're 18 years old to apply for a passport. So the fact, I guess you could say, that people living in Argentina or Brazil with a distant Italian relative were able to get a passport more easily than the children of migrants who speak fluent Italian and are born and raised here. I guess in that sense, it's a good thing that this law is changing. Let's see if things are made easier for those people, for those migrants living in Italy in June come the referendum, Andrew.
Ed Stocker in Milan, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally on today's show, the 2025 Michelin Guide has been released and would seem to suggest that fine dining in France is in excellent health. Fully 68 French eateries have received new stars, with 2 being elevated to the gastronomic pinnacle of a 3-star rank. I'm joined with more by Chiara Rimella, host of Monocle Radio's The Menu. Chiara, first of all, does this seem like an unusually generous distribution? Are they usually this profligate with their stars?
Well, I would say that France has a lot at stake when it comes to announcing its own Michelin stars, because obviously as the home of the guide, you sort of want to maintain this reputation worldwide for being the home of kind of haute cuisine. And so far, France is remaining the country with the highest number of 3-star restaurants around the world. You may say that's biased, but such is the case. There are 10 3-star restaurants just in Paris alone. I would say that the distribution was not over profligate in Paris, but there are some interesting additions that I think speak of changed attitude perhaps in terms of the way that Michelin inspectors are going about their business. It's been a few years now since they've started handing out interesting awards to roadside stalls in places like famously Singapore or stands in Mexico City. They're not quite doing that in Paris, but I think there is a sense that they want to shed this reputation for an elitist type of approach to cuisine and also rewarding other approaches.
I mean, how careful do they need to be about that, though? Because surely at some level the elitism is the point.
Yeah, I don't know if elitism is the point. I suppose the criteria for the 3-star mark is for gastronomy to be elevated to an art form, for chefs to be at the peak of their profession. And certain places that have sort of not really stayed true to this idea, despite being very elitist, have been downgraded in the past. I don't think it's just a given. I think it's interesting that so many neo-bistros are actually on the list in Paris now. We're seeing a huge popularity for the format of the Parisian bistro around the world. In London, there are plenty of kind of these new types of French restaurants opening. And even back home, it's a format that's being rediscovered. And there are plenty of bistros on the Michelin list for Paris, from Petrus to Le Turbuchon Rodier. Paulonia is being awarded as well. So I think it's interesting that also beyond that, the guide is branching out, I suppose, beyond the idea of the French fine dining that many of us may have baked in our heads, the kind of those starched white tablecloths, and rewarding lots of places that are cooking international cuisine as well, from Polish to Tunisian to Korean. There's plenty more diversity in the list now.
And is Michelin concerned, though, maybe about not quite wielding the influence it once did in a world of limitless, really, judges, critics and influencers?
This is a really interesting question, and one that I think they are certainly very concerned with. I would bring up a report in the Financial Times that I saw just a few days ago, which had to do with a real analysis of which kind of factors affect bookings at restaurants. This was a case study in London, or at least in the UK, not necessarily in France, but I think it's still interesting, really breaking down which factors were most influential, be it, going viral on social media, be it reviews in old school restaurants, or being awarded a Michelin star. And it was really interesting that perhaps these days we might think that the online buzz is more important for restaurants, but actually for restaurants like Chishuru here in London, being awarded a Michelin star is really what skyrocketed their popularity in the city. So we may think that it's not really that relevant anymore, but it certainly carries kudos and carries weight. I suppose it's a bit like the discussion around the Oscars. We like to believe that it's not really that important anymore, but we're still tuning in. We're still talking about it.
Chiara Rimella, host of The Menu on Monocle Radio, thank you for joining us. That is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Monica Lillis, our researcher was Francesca Jilks, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing returns tomorrow at the same time, midday London. I'm Andrew Muller. Thanks for listening.